Hey everyone, welcome back. We love to dive deep into the interesting mix of sources you sent, and today is no exception. Looks like we're tackling addiction recovery, but, and this is where it gets really interesting, we're looking at it from two totally different angles.
Two angles is a great way to put it. We've got the medical model, yeah, but also this whole other layer of finding wholeness as a son of God. It's a pretty profound contrast.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, so to set the stage, one of the sources lays out addiction as this chronic disease, how it really hijacks the brain, messing with reward systems, motivation, everything. It paints a pretty stark picture of this constant struggle.
Right, and it's because of that chronic aspect that a lot of those traditional recovery models, like the 12 steps, they really hammer home that continuous effort, having that support system, preventing relapse. It's a journey.
Definitely. Our brains are complex, change takes time.
Mm.
But then you've got this other source that comes in with this whole different perspective. It's this idea of sonship in Christian theology. And here, it's not just managing a disease, it's like stepping into a brand new identity.
Yeah, it's a total shift.
Yeah.
This source, they pull from John 1:12-13, and the big takeaway is that for believers, there's this right, to become children of God. It's not about always trying to be better, it's about embracing being made new.
Wow. So we're already seeing two distinct paths here. It's like, on one hand, you've got this ongoing process, this recovery, managing your behavior, leaning on your support system. And then on the flip side, there's this one-time internal transformation through faith. You're putting your dependence on, well, a higher power, literally.
And that transformation, that's where your source talks about complete restoration through Christ. But to really get that, we have to unpack what complete restoration really means, because it's not just about not being addicted anymore. It's way deeper than that. It's this internal realignment.
Right, because Ephesians 2.45, it talks about being made alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions.
Yeah.
So it's not just about behavior modification, right? It's like
Yeah.
this total internal, makeover.
Totally. This source seems to be saying that real change, it starts on a spiritual level and then it impacts everything else. It challenges that whole idea of just managing a condition and points to a true transformation from the inside out.
Man, that's a huge difference. And then it makes you think about, if someone sees themselves not just as someone battling addiction, but as a child of God, how does that change their experience? How does that change their journey? That's what I'm really curious about.
And that's the core of it. And that's exactly what we're going to dig into next. We'll look at how this sonship might impact well-being, their sense of self, their shame, even their motivation to stay sober.
So we've got these two contrasting ideas about addiction. On one side, it's this ongoing process of recovery. On the other, there's this complete restoration through this idea of being a son of God. But how does that actually play out in someone's life? What's the real difference?
That's the heart of it, right? Your source really hones in on this sense of wholeness that comes with sonship. Think about it. In the traditional recovery model, it's all about striving. You're constantly working to stay sober, right? But with sonship, you're already seen as whole, complete, and that's in God's eyes. Doesn't matter what you're struggling with.
So it's less about fixing something that's broken and more about stepping into something that's already there, this acceptance.
Yes, exactly. I mean, imagine the difference, right? Between trying to earn your worth and just knowing it deep down, knowing you're inherently worthy. That's huge, especially for someone battling addiction who's probably dealing with a ton of shame and self-doubt. And that actually leads perfectly into another big point from your source: freedom from shame.
Yeah, that makes sense. Addiction carries so much baggage. There's the stigma, the self-blame. It's easy to get trapped in that cycle of guilt.
Absolutely. And that's where this source brings in 1 John 1:9. It says, "If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness." So the idea is when you embrace sonship, that shame starts to lift because you've been forgiven. You're not stuck trying to make up for your past.
You can actually move forward. That's powerful. But okay, let's talk about behavior for a second. If we're talking about real change,
Yeah.
does someone just stop struggling with addiction because they see themselves as a son of God?
Right. And your source actually addresses that directly. It's not about pretending addiction isn't real or that everything magically disappears overnight, but it's about how you approach those struggles. You're coming at it from a totally different place.
So it's less about instant healing and more about being equipped.
Right.
Being equipped to deal with those challenges in a new way.
Exactly. Think of it this way. You've got two ships caught in a storm, right? One's a tiny raft just getting tossed around. The other's this sturdy vessel. It's got a good crew, a strong anchor. They're both in the same storm, but their ability to weather it, totally different.
Okay, yeah. I like that. But what about getting help, like professional help? Does this whole sonship thing replace therapy or medication?
That's another important point. Your source is really clear about this. Embracing your spiritual identity doesn't mean you don't need professional support. It's more like faith can actually work together with therapy and medical treatment. It's like weaving together all these different threads of healing. It makes the whole tapestry stronger.
So it's not either, it's more like both hand. That makes
Yeah.
sense. Especially for people who are trying to figure out how their faith fits in with their recovery.
Absolutely. And that's where we start to see faith in action, which, that's where we're heading next. We'll look at some of the practical ways this sonship can actually play out, how it can support and strengthen recovery.
So we've talked about this big idea of spiritual transformation, but let's get down to brass tacks. How does this sonship thing actually work in real life? What does it look like day to day?
Yeah, it's about bridging that gap, right? Going
Wow.
from concept to reality. And your source points to those faith-based recovery programs like Celebrate Recovery. They bring together the support groups, the accountability, all that good stuff, but then they weave in Christian teachings.
So it's like taking those practical tools and giving them this whole other dimension, the spiritual grounding.
Exactly. But it's not just about formal programs. Your source also talks about personal devotion, like prayer, spending time in the Bible, just taking time to reflect. That's how you build that relationship with God. And that relationship, that's where the strength comes from.
So it's not just about showing up to church on Sunday. It's about making those spiritual practices part of your everyday life.
Right. Especially when things get tough. And that's another thing. The church community itself can be a huge part of this. Knowing you belong, having that support from people who get it, who share your faith, it creates this amazing network.
Which in a way that kind of mirrors the support system you see in traditional recovery, doesn't it? But with this added layer of shared faith, a
Yeah.
deeper connection.
Absolutely. Strength and shared experience, shared belief. And while we won't get into specifics today, your source does mention that there's more and more research out there, plus all those personal stories, right? It all points to the idea that faith can really help people in recovery.
So it's not just anecdotal, there's actual evidence to back it up.
It's definitely worth checking out. Always encourage you to see what resonates with you. But I think the bottom line here, the big takeaway from your sources, is that it doesn't have to be one or the other. Recovery is so personal, right? So if it's therapy, medication, faith, whatever works, what brings that healing, that wholeness, that's what matters.
It's about owning your journey, finding what works for you, which I think brings us to the heart of it, wouldn't you say?
Totally. I mean, it all boils down to perspective. Recovery is often about managing something, right? But this sonship thing, it's a total identity shift.
It's like instead of seeing yourself as someone who has an addiction, you're someone who's loved and accepted no matter what. That's got to be a powerful place to start,
No doubt. And it opens up so many questions, doesn't it?
right? Like if you really embrace that, knowing that you're a son or daughter of God, loved unconditionally, how would that change not just how you deal with addiction, but how you deal with anything life throws at you? That's something to think about for sure.
Definitely something to chew on.
Always a pleasure diving into these topics with you. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. Keep those amazing sources coming. And until next time, stay curious.